Hello and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Edward Knight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today's show, we're talking about the OCR, the official cash rate. It's just gone up. What does it mean for interest rates? What does it mean for the future of property investment? So, Andrew, walk us through what happened last week. What did our buddy old Adrian all come out and say?
Well, it's the first time in 7 years that the official cash rate has been increased, and it went up 25 basis points from 0.25% to now 0.5%. And why'd they do that? Well, we're now fighting inflation. So we've now got inflation in New Zealand, and the target for the Reserve Bank is between 1 to 3%. And in the last quarter, we had 3.3%. So they're outside of what their ideal target is. And they're estimating that inflation is going to get to around 4%, and then it'll start to peter off and come back to around 2. So 2 is kind of the optimum kind of number that they work for, but they want to signal that they're serious about battling the inflation that we're now facing. And Ed, why are we seeing inflation?
Well, it's quite interesting. A lot of that inflation that you're seeing in terms of pushing us up to 3.3 and actually the stuff that's going to push us up to 4, some of that, to be fair, is one-off inflation. So it's not the sort of inflation the Reserve Bank, sits up at night worrying about because they can't really control it. But those sorts of things I'm talking about, oil increases in the price of oil. That's going to cause inflation, but the Reserve Bank can't really do anything about it. It's kind of more headline rather than underlying inflation. But here is the key reason why we're starting to see interest rates increase. Because we have It's because we have been in a very stimulatory position from our monetary policy. So what I mean by that is the Reserve Bank has thrust us into the position where interest rates have been extremely low. And because of that, we're in what they would consider to be a really stimulatory position. Rates are at the point where we're all incentivized to go out, to invest, to buy some extra stuff, buy some extra properties because interest rates are so low. And because interest rates are in that setting, naturally, we're starting to take notice and already have been, where we're like, sweet, let's go buy some stuff, whether it be spa pools, whether it be businesses, whether it be houses, whatever it happens to be. And so we've got demand returning pretty strongly, people going out and purchasing. And it's got to the point where we are also at the same time very capacity constrained. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that there's not enough people in the country to do all of the jobs that need to be done. So unemployment is very, very low and employment is very, very high. You'll remember some of the articles coming out about fruit rotting on the vines in certain parts of New Zealand because there aren't enough people to go and pick it. Raw materials are getting very expensive. We've seen that inflation in terms of building costs. And shipping is getting far more expensive because a lot of the shipping vessels are either in the wrong place around the world, or the ports are so busy that you've got vessels waiting to be berthed in some of these ports. And all of this is causing higher prices and things to get more expensive. So we've got really high demand. We've got relatively tight supply for the reasons we've just outlined. This is causing prices to increase. And because of that, we're seeing that inflation. So the Reserve Bank's coming in, higher OCR, wanting to start to calm down that market. And it's important to note as well, they have put the large-scale asset purchasing program on hold as well to try and fight that inflation. But the big question is, what effect will this have on property investors? Because there's a good effect and there's a bad effect. But Andrew, tell us about the bad effect first.
Well, I think the first major thing is that you're going to see higher borrowing costs. So you can expect interest rates to rise. And actually, leading up to the OCR increase, I think that expectation flowed through to the interest rates that are coming out from banks. So you'll notice in the last sort of month that interest rates have been tracking upwards, and I think even ANZ might have increased theirs last week, which was the week the OCR was adjusted. And so you can probably see that that's going to carry on more. Definitely, all the floating rates have gone up, which is kind of the one that's most likely to be affected by the OCR. But don't forget the banks use any opportunities to increase interest rates.
And it's interesting to note that only 2 months ago, the Reserve Bank did some really interesting research, which they released in one of their analytical notes, talking about, well, what effect does the OCR actually have on mortgage rates? Now, what they've said is that 100 basis point change in the OCR, so 1 percentage point increase in the OCR, say from 0.25 to 1.25%. They've gone through and they've said, well, what impact does that have on the 2-year mortgage interest rate? And what they've said is that it takes time for that to be passed through. So after a month, they'd expect about 34% of that change to be passed through into the 2-year rate. So if it was a 1% increase, they'd expect 0.34% to be passed through into the 2-year rate. And over a 6-month period, they'd expect about 80% of that to go through. So what we haven't seen straight away is, after this announcement, is banks necessarily increasing their interest rates in terms of their mortgage interest rates. We haven't seen that. But we'd expect that slowly over time, this direction of travel will start to have an influence on the mortgage rates that you are paying at the commercial bank. So you might not see a change the day after the OCR, especially to the mortgage rates. So the floating, you definitely will. But for those long-term interest rates, you may not see any at all. But the second effect, so obviously the first effect is higher borrowing costs, but the second effect, and I always think that property investors forget about this one, is that the size of your debt is decreasing in real terms. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's say that inflation hits 4%. And let's say it does that for 2 years and then goes to 2%. Well, over those 3 years, the cost of goods has gone up by 10%. And if you've been able to increase your income by just that, the inflation rate, you've potentially got 10% more income because we've been in some high inflationary times. And relatively speaking, the size of your debt has decreased. So inflation in many ways is a transfer of wealth from lenders to borrowers because the size of your debt is decreasing in real terms. And so you do pay for that, don't get me wrong. You do pay for it in terms of having higher borrowing costs and having more interest to pay. But also the size of your debt's decreasing in relative to your income and relative to general prices. And I always say that the most important thing in property investment is to get in early and to lock in what your mortgage is straight away. Because over time, in 10 years' time, we're going to see 20-odd% inflation, or it might be 30% inflation, whatever it happens to be. Incomes will go up, prices will go up, rents will go up, but your mortgage will either stay the same if you've got it on interest only, in terms of nominal terms, in terms of what the actual dollar value is, or potentially go down if you're on principal and interest payments. So always important to lock in that mortgage so that you can have that natural appreciation, not just in terms of house prices, but in terms of incomes and general prices as well. That's my little economics rant. But just tell me as well, Andrew, how closely does the OCR and the different mortgage rates actually correlate? And what's the difference between them?
Well, I think when you were talking about the OCR, it tends to affect those shorter term rates more often. So your 6-month rate, your 1-year fixed rate, and your floating rate, obviously. So the 1-year fixed rate tends to follow it very, very closely. Obviously, if the official cash rate goes up 0.25, you expect the floating rate to go up at a similar rate. Sometimes banks might have a little bit more of a margin in there and then they don't bring it down quite as much, but that's just the way it is. 5-year rate's a little bit different though, Ed, right?
Definitely the 5-year rate. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. So after the GFC, Jan 2008, we saw the OCR plummet from over 8% to just over 2%. Now, of course, the 5-year rate at that time did start to plummet, but even while the OCR stayed low at about 2.25%, we still saw the 5-year rate start to rocket up from 7 up to about 9%. And when we model these out, we can see that sometimes the 5-year rates will jump even while the OCR has remained relatively stagnant. That happened in about 2013 as well, where the 5-year rate started to increase from just over 6% up to around that 7% mark, kind of. Even though the OCR was pretty flat. And even if we think about the last couple of months, what have we seen? Well, the OCR has been pretty steady, 0.25, and yet the 5-year interest rate has increased from roughly 2.99 to 3.99, depending on which bank you're talking about. So, the longer term interest rates just don't follow the OCR as closely, and so you'll see more variation. The direction of travel might be the same. But that's not necessarily causal from the OCR. It comes from some of the other factors that might drive interest rates up or down as well. But I suppose, let's talk about some predictions. Let's look into our tea leaves, Andrew. Into our little
I was going to
teacup.
say tea leaves.
Oh gosh, it's because I was looking at the tea leaves. I knew you were going to be able to say that. What do you think is going to happen, say, to the 1 year rate over the next couple of years?
So I think if you look historically, generally speaking, you'll see that there's about a 2% margin between the OCR and the 1 year fixed interest rate. And you're going to see that OCR creep up over the next wee while. So you're probably going to see interest rates with a 4 in front of them sooner than we originally thought. So particularly if you're going to go short term, what you might start to see is that tipping of the balance. So some of the shorter term rates might become higher than the longer term rates again. And that's not uncommon to see that. And so banks might incentivize you to fix for a longer period of time. But I do think if you're doing your modelling, you do want to be factoring in some interest rates with a 4 in front of them sooner rather than later now. Anything to add there, Tiny Tony?
Not Tiny Tony, Baby Tony, thank you, Andrew. But one thing to just note is tomorrow's episode, we're going to go through and talk about how do you choose that interest rate as well. And I've got a wee spreadsheet we're going to go through, which is going to be quite good. Now, just walk us through, though, Andrew, what other effect do you think that these interest rate changes are going to have on property investors? How is property investment going to change as we start to see interest rates rise?
Well, you're going to hear the word negative gearing, or words negative gearing, come back. And again, every property can be positively geared if you're prepared to put some money in. But given that most property investors use equity in their existing properties rather than cash to buy rental properties, and they borrow 100%, you can expect to be contributing towards your investment rather than it just being break even or positively geared. But that's not a bad thing. So negative gearing has a negative word, the word negative, and so often it can kind of make people cringe. But there's not any investment that I know of that doesn't require some input at some stage, other than robbing a bank perhaps. So you do have to think about this as an investment. And so if you're buying a rental property, if you are modelling out the next 15 years worth of interest rates, don't be shocked if you have a contribution to put in. That's completely normal. It's just that we've had quite a few abnormal years of low interest rates.
And just to speak about the impact it'll have generally on the market, it shouldn't have too much of an impact in terms of the availability of credit, because of course all of our mortgages are generally tested at higher interest rates. So, perhaps a 5.8% or a 6.5%. So what really impacts the availability of credit is when those servicing test interest rates change. Now, to be fair, we have seen BNZ come out and raising that rate from 6.15% is what I think it was, to about 6.5 now. So we're seeing a little bit of change there, but I haven't seen too many banks follow. Perhaps we will as we start to see those interest rates rise. So I think the important thing to note is it's going to come down to a bit of sentiment. Maybe this will impact the sentiment we have about people getting out and purchasing. But look, as we said, we're going to talk over the next couple of episodes, I think later on next week, about first home buyers. And the data we're seeing is that even with these higher interest rates, as they have started to flow through, first home buyers are still active out there in the market. So we'll talk more about that when we get to those episodes. Hey, let's wrap it up there, but please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Really does help us get the message out to more people. And hey, you want to learn more about property investment? Come along to our next webinar. We're talking about how do you live off your property investment portfolio? How do you use property to fund the lifestyle you want to live? Want to come along to that? Tap or swipe over the cover art. There'll be a link in there. Or just go to opuspartners.co.nz/webinar. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Ed McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And we're going to be back here tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.